this case, someone must be right and someone must be wrong. And I'm going to repeat that again. In these type of conversations in which you have objective, measurable data, then there's no really a debate. It's just a matter of true or false. The problem is when people are confused about, well, I don't believe that is to be true. Well, that is a belief, but that doesn't mean that it's not true. They just believe that you believe that is not true. But again, that is true. Hello and welcome back to this video, and I'm going to continue with the biases series, and today I'm going to talk about the false equivalencies or false equivalence fallacies. But before I do, I actually have to confess that I've decided to skip some of the subjects, and I wanted to talk about this one. And the reason why I decided to do that is because I've been seeing a lot of content that, although I'm not opposed necessarily to it, I think it might be problematic if we don't put it into a proper context. So that is the context showing, the content, excuse me, showing two opposing views. And again, I wanted to clarify that I don't necessarily think that this is an extremely dangerous, but there's some nuances that I actually would like to discuss. But first, what is a false equivalency? So basically, a false equivalence occurs when we actually compare two things as equal, even when they're not. The problem with most false equivalencies or false equivalence fallacies is that they might actually have some things in common, meaning things that you're trying to compare might have something in common. For example, if I say to you that a fork and a gun can actually be used as weapons, therefore they're the same thing, obviously I'm making a false equivalence, but it is true that you can actually kill someone by using a fork. But again, not only the usage of a fork as a utensil to eat and the usage of a gun as a utensil to shoot and pretty much kill someone are different. But even if we accept that premise of you can use both to kill someone, the degree in which you can actually use both as weapons are very, very different, and that's what makes this a false equivalency. So another example, a couple of weeks ago, I was actually talking to a friend of mine who were telling me that he was very depressed, and we were talking about when all of this started. And he was telling me how a couple of years ago, his mother had passed away, unfortunately, and he was understandably depressed. And he told me that after a couple of months of being secluded, he decided to go out, and that's where he started to see some people that he hadn't seen in months, including friends and some acquaintances. And then when asked about how he was doing, he would say the normal, like, I don't know if you have heard, but my mom died and I have been kind of lost. I have been kind of like depressed. And surprisingly, some people reacted by saying, well, I got you. I totally feel how you're feeling. I've also been depressed because of work. And of course, that is not only a false equivalence, but something terrible to say to somebody who's going through that level of depressed, right? Now, I'm not saying that those people were intentionally mean, although again, there is an awful thing to say, but maybe they felt awkward. Maybe they felt like they were feeling when my friend was saying that his mother had died, they were feeling awkward, or maybe they thought that by saying that they were also depressed, that would look as an attempt to sympathize with him. But obviously it was something very inappropriate at the very least to say to anybody. Now, what are the reasons behind these false equivalence or false equivalence fallacy? Why do we tend to put two things together even when they're not equivalent to each other? Well, as I always like to have a starting point, and again, I use a definition, but now I kind of like to start tying everything together. I'm going to start now approach this from a more philosophical point of view. And this entropy that we call nature, and by entropy, I actually mean synonym of disorder or randomness, we can find plenty of examples of compensatory mechanisms that are used to maintain balance. As we know, we call this as homeostasis, excuse me. So, for example, we find animals with some interesting compensatory mechanisms to compensate, for example, for extreme or against extreme weather conditions. And even at a cellular level, we can find these compensatory mechanisms. This homeostasis is crucial Like, for example, when we eat too much salt, the way that our body normally compensates that is by retaining more water to maintain that relationship or that proportion between the amount of salt, in this case, more sodium than anything else, and the water levels, right? So as you can see, there are plenty of examples in nature that shows us how important it is to maintain balance. Our psychology is no different, and when we encounter different points of view, we tend to look at two ideas and find a way to maintain a balance or center position between those two ideas. But this is where the fallacy actually starts. The fallacy starts by consider two different ideas and see them as opposing views or as opposing points in the spectrum. As I discussed in the video about the decoy effect, the perception of both sides is relative to the environment. That means that, for example, as I mentioned in that video, if you go to a store wanting to purchase a watch and then your budget is $400, and when you arrive there, the salesperson says that you have a really nice watch that is $300, and then there's another watch that is $500. You probably will go for the $300 watch since your budget is actually close to that. It's $400. Now, if the salesperson says, "Oh, by the way, this new watch just arrived and it had all the features that you wanted, plus all the features that you encounter on the $500, plus these other amazing features that you might encounter beneficial, but it costs $1,000." Psychology shows that you will probably rethink your purchase and will go for the $500 because now, comparatively, the $300 is perceived as too cheap. Nothing has changed in terms of the individual prices of all these watches. The only thing that actually has changed was the introduction of a new item and the perception of the relative value of the items with respect of one another. So basically, you introduce now a new item, and then now instead of being perceived as the old one was perceived as reasonable, now it's started to perceive as the cheap one. I also said in that video that this concept is not an exclusive domain on pricing. Ideas also depend on people's perception, and the perception changes according to the options that you're given. So without getting into too much into politics, because I hate that, but I was thinking about ways in which I can illustrate this point, and I cannot think of a better example than politics. Let's take that idea, for example, of universal healthcare and universal education. So here in the United States, a large proportion of Republicans oppose that idea of giving everyone free college and free healthcare. There are very different reasons as to why, ranging from who's going to pay for that, people are going to feel entitled, people will not want to work enough. A big portion of Democrats are in favor of those ideas. One side sees the other as too extreme in their views, and that's how nothing pretty much gets solved because one thing gets opposed by the opposition, and they think that they both are wrong. Interestingly, for example, in Spain, like in most European countries, those views are defended by the vast majority of people, but also including the right-wing politics. I cannot think of anybody truly in Spain who would think about um, eliminating any of these programs. I've met people who question the expenses of that and questions, for example, there might be disagreements about the cost or how to make those services more efficient. But I cannot truly think about a way in which, or I haven't met many people who will discuss this as a negative outcome. I can't think of any opposition or real opposition to this idea. The reason is, again, because they're two, even if there are different opinions, and there are opinions, obviously, like in the United States, in which people are opposing certain ideas to other ideas, debate. And I'm not suggesting that there's no debate in Spain, but it definitely, when it comes to these interesting subjects, since there's a lot of benefits that I think people have felt throughout all these programs through centuries now, well, centuries, decades. Obviously, people will not oppose that idea, and definitely not the political parties, because again, that's what most people agree with, right? Now, again, you might have an additional agreement about the costs and how to make those services more efficient, but there are no discussions about the validity of having free healthcare or free education. A possible reason behind um, why is that difference between the US having such a large population opposing this and seeing that as an extreme point of view, and the Spanish, for example, point of view, which not only is not an extreme view, but is something that is widely accepted by everyone, is that, for example, in the US, you have two major political parties. And yes, in Spain, you have several political parties, including socialists, communists, and other parties on the left of that. There's not a defense or condemnation, by the way, of or to any ideology or any ideology. I'm just simply stating a fact. Like there are differences in terms of politics, and there's definitely differences in terms of what we perceive as an extreme or other extreme. When you have, for example, a political party that opposes an idea and another one that supports it, if you're part of one political party, you tend to agree with the party's policy. So in that case, if you only have two options and one is in favor and the other one opposes that idea, well, then obviously, if you are siding with the opposition in other subjects, you probably will tend to oppose that as well. So again, in the US, some Republicans refer to the Democrats as the left wing party and even refer them as socialists. But having lived, for example, and having not only lived, but being raised in a country where socialism not only does exist, in fact, the current president of Spain is from the Socialist Party, I can actually tell the difference. And in fact, the center right politicians of Spain, named Partido Popular, and even some people on the right of that, have way more things in common with the Democrats that they do with the Republicans. So what you probably are asking yourself, well, what does this have to do with the perception of reality? Why is it that is a different perception? Like, why is it? What does this mean in terms of how we perceive reality? Well, in this example, for example, the reason why Republicans might think Democrats are socialists is because there's nothing else to compare them with. You just have one right, one left, and there's nothing else. But again, um, it's not necessarily that there's a left and a right. It's just that you have two positions, and then you choose one. That means that the other one has to be in the opposite side. On the flip side, in Spain, there's this idea that the political parties on the right, name again Partido Popular and Vox, are far right. Also, a centrist political party called Ciudadanos is considered right wing by some people in Spain. There's a similar reason behind this perception. In Spain, politics are more skewed to the left, while, for example, in the United States, are more skewed to the right. And as you can see, the perception of left and right is determined in part by the system that you have in your country and by the options available in the same country. It's similar to what happens with the decoy effect. Everything depends on what is available to you. So again, Democrats are perceived as left just because there's nothing else. If there's all of a sudden a political party, a true socialist political party, separate from the Democrats who were gaining force, and then people were paying attention to them, and you see more radical ideas, all of a sudden the Democrats will not be perceived as people on the left. It will be just perceived as a center. In this example, if we say, for example, the Democratic Party is a left-wing party and therefore is the same as the Podemos party, which is pretty much the left of the left in Spain, because they're both left-wing parties. Again, if we establish that connection between the Democrats in the United States with Podemos in Spain, of course we would be making a false equivalence. In fact, if we actually get the Democrats or the democratic policies and we brought them together to Spain, and those policies would then be perceived or considered as right-wing policies. So again, those policies that here in the United States are deemed as left policies, most of these policies in Spain would actually be considered very either center or right wing. Despite that, there is a tendency for people in the United States to call Democrats socialists and compare them with, for example, Maduro from Venezuela, or the tendency in Spain to compare the right wing with fascists. That, of course, all of that is a false equivalence. Now, why do we fall for these? How do we fall for a false equivalence or for the false equivalence fallacy? One of the reasons, and that is pretty much the best answer that I can give you. I know this is going to sound very simplistic, but it's a first, actually, the most important that I would say reason. It's because it's easy. Following the example with the Spanish politics, even though there are different political parties, most people actually tend to vote for and still vote for the two major political parties, which again is the Socialist Party and the Partido Popular, which is the right wing. So again, left and right, the same reason why there are two political parties here in the United States. It is easier for us to deal with fewer options. In his book, The Paradox of Choice, Why More is Less, author Barry Schwartz argues a lot about the importance of choices. And he argues that an increased amount of choices can actually lead to more stress, anxiety, and more importantly, a paralysis in your decision making. We have discussed this thing in the past. I think that we were talking about anxiety, especially when we were talking about the reasons behind our choices, not only for confirmation bias, but specifically for the in-group bias and the groupthink. Now, when talking about anxiety and the effect of stress in the way we make choices, the way we learn and even our memory is um, related to those levels of stress. So again, stress has an important role in not only our learning process, decision making, but also our memory. A simple solution to this dilemma would be to have fewer options, and that is pretty much what author of The Paradox of Choice, Barry Schwartz, was kind of suggesting on his book. Being easy is not the only reason. Obviously, I'm not going to make it so simplistic or so simple as to say, well, it's just because it's easy. There's also other things or other reasons why we fall for these false equivalence or false equivalence fallacy. As I also explained in the in-group bias video, belonging to a group is key to our survival. Obviously, our ancestors wouldn't pick a group that they perceive or deem as weak. Um, and neither would you. Probably you would perceive or you would want to join a group that you perceive that has a higher chance of survival, or the things that at least will give you a comfort. Obviously, our ancestors wouldn't pick again that group. In fact, the opposite is true. We tend to choose groups that we perceive as a group with the highest chances of survival. And again, this is just a matter of survival. It's a matter of not only a perception of what is best or what is worst, but a matter of survival. And again, it's also a matter of perception, because when we talk about what is best or what is worst, what is going to give you the higher chance of or a higher rate of success in surviving, you're not necessarily talking about things that are real, tangible. They're talking about things, your perception of what is increasing your chances of survival. Now, because these groups tend to be the ones that accumulate the most people, meaning the people when you're attracted to one particular group, chances are that a lot of people are attracted to the same type of group. Chances are again that those groups that you're part of tend to accumulate the most people. We're contributing by actually siding with one of these groups. We're contributing to an even bigger gap between certain groups and others. And in certain instances, this system contributes to the creation of two different groups or two different sides of an issue. And that is where the problem actually starts, with the two different sides of the story, or two different points of view. In reality, we find a large variety of people in different gradations, between one side and other. And what I mean by that is there's this obsession about looking at things from two perspectives. And again, it's an easier one. But in reality, you just barely find these opposing views. There's no opposing necessarily views. There's way more views. There's just people who are on this side, people who are on the other side, and a lot of people who think some things in between. So again, it's not only a matter of one side or the other one. However, when we start siding with one side, when we're starting choosing with one side or choosing one side and then siding with them and adopting that group thing and in-group bias, we tend to not only enlarge the difference or making a gap, a bigger gap between both. It's just that we start having that perception that there truly exists only two points of view. When in reality, as I said before, we find an enormous variety of people in different gradations between one side and the other. But because, again, of interactions with other people and because external pressures, people tend to pick sides and form parts of groups that might merge and form bigger groups. And at the end, those two groups or three groups, depending on the issues that we're talking about, tend to become larger and larger and larger. In such situations, we would have three positions. In most cases, we would have people who think one thing, people who think the opposite thing, and the people who are in the middle. So again, one side, the other side, in the middle. Keep in mind that all of these doesn't correspond to anything that is tangible. There's no such thing. There's no one side and the other one. It's just that you have chosen one side, and then you might have a lot in common with people who are on that side. But keep in mind that, as we have discussed in the in-group bias and the group think in particular, a lot of the times what happens is that you start neglecting your personal individual choices, and then you start adopting the group thing or the thought process of the group, because it's not only more comfortable, but because you feel more protected. So that was one of the reasons why groupthink is it's natural when you adopt you're part of a group, because again, being part of a group gives you enormous advantages. Now, all of these is just a matter of perception. Now we could ask ourselves, why do we even choose a side in the first place? And what is behind our choices? Like, what is it that is behind this necessity of making a choice or choosing? Now, that's when the neuroscience of this episode comes in handy. Now, from a neuroscience point of view, there are several structures, and we'll go through it as quickly as possible, involving decision making, and most of them are located as part of the prefrontal cortex. But I'm going to establish that from the beginning, that we have unconscious choices and conscious choices. Now, first ones, I'm going to talk about the orbitofrontal cortex, and that is located in the bottom of the prefrontal cortex. Let me explain. I think that I have explained this in the past. So if this is our fist / brain, so you can see here, that portion when you make a fist that is in touch or touching the thumb, opposing to the thumb, this portion here would be the orbitofrontal cortex. Imagine that again, you make that fist, and the portion that is touching is the one that is touching the thumb. It would be the orbitofrontal cortex. And that is not the only part of the prefrontal cortex that is in charge. In fact, there's two more in charge of or intervene in decision making. There are actually two more. The other one is the anterior cingulate cortex. And to represent that is, imagine that you're doing the fist, and then now you're kind of moving or separating your index finger and the pinky, leaving the two middle finger and the ring finger now still opposing to the thumb. In this case, those sides, on the sides of those fingers, would be where the anterior cingulate cortex will be located. Again, this is a little bit more on the inside of the brain. The other one that I described, the orbitofrontal cortex, will be a little more in the cortex, on the surface. This one, the anterior cingulate cortex, will be actually a little more on the inside. Now, there's another portion of the prefrontal cortex, and if you put the fingers back again, forming the fist, these two portions that are to the outsides of the brain, in this case, that would be this side and this side, would correspond with the dorsolateral portion of the prefrontal cortex. And that is also a portion of the prefrontal cortex that is engaged in decision making. So these areas that are, again, part of the prefrontal cortex, as we have discussed in the past, the prefrontal cortex being the coordinator and organizer, of the brain. These areas in particular are in charge of planning and reasoning. In these cortical areas, remember cortical because are on the cortex on the surface, are what we would call the voluntary part of the decision making. But as I said before, there's also an involuntary portion on decision making, and that is, or those are the portions that are actually part of the inside of the brain, meaning that it's going to be a little more in the inside, not on the surface of the brain. And I'm going to mention two in particular. One is going to be actually three. Two are similar because they're close in location. One is the amygdala, and I have spoken that in the past. And those are the two almond-shaped nuclei that are going to find at the base of the brain. And the amygdala are those structures that are involved in the decision making, and especially in autonomic responses to an emotional stimuli. Also, the thalamus, and the thalamus is located literally at the center of the brain. For that, I would actually have to open the fist, and you would see it right here in the middle. Also is in charge of that an involuntary portion of the decision making of the brain. And the thalamus and the amygdala, again, would represent these involuntary portion of the decision making, but we have a third portion that is in charge on the decision making. But this is actually more, not necessarily only exclusively related to movement, but mostly related to movement. And that is where we talk about the cerebellum. And we have discussed the cerebellum in a different video, the last video in particular, where we were talking about the automatic bias. In this case, we were talking about automation, and we were talking about automatization of movement. If you remember, the cerebellum was actually a separate structure. So if this is the entire encephalus is whatever it is inside the skull, right? But the encephalus is divided by different portions. The cerebrum is what we were discussing right now. All of the portions that I was discussing about, whether it is on the cortex or the inside, are the cerebrum, which is, again, just a portion of the encephalus. But a separate entity outside of that cerebrum, and actually on the back and lower part, meaning behind and on the bottom of that, you would encounter this cerebellum. And it is mostly in charge of processing or calibration, meaning adjustment of movement. As you can see, decision making depends on both voluntary and involuntary inputs. Some research has suggested that stress, for example, might influence neural circuits involving reward processing and learning, facilitating or making it more difficult for you to learn. So again, it's not only about facilitating, because a lot of people feel, or the opposite. Some people think that, well, stress is definitely not going to contribute to anything. It's going to be actually a bad thing for my learning. And then you have other people who think, well, I think the opposite. I think the stress is wonderful. That's the way I learn. Well, it turns out that they're both right and they're both wrong at the same time. So, as I've explained in the past, there are two types of stress. One is the intrinsic stress, and the other one is the extrinsic stress. Intrinsic stress is the stress that you feel and is directly related to the execution of a skill. Like, for example, imagine doing a physical task, like, for example, playing basketball. If you're playing basketball and you are trying to dribble and you're trying to shoot or looking for the perfect angle to shoot the ball, that is a form of intrinsic stress. Again, that is something that can actually be beneficial for your learning process. But people insulting you or throwing things to your face while you're trying to play basketball are not definitely intrinsic. They're extrinsic stress. And not only does it not contribute to anything good to your learning or good to your learning process, but it can actually be very detrimental to your learning. Another more subtle way in which extrinsic stress would be another way in which extrinsic stress participates. It's not necessarily something that is external, because when we talk about external, we tend to think about people outside me would actually cause these problems, but it's not necessarily that. And this is a little bit more subtle, because this has to do with how you perceive the outside. So if, for example, I give you or increase the number of choices, there will be a spike on extrinsic stress. So let me rephrase that. So if I give you a certain amount of choices, and this is doable for you, you feel capable, that still can be considered intrinsic stress, like a good type of stress. You feel like motivated because now you have all different options, and you feel rewarded because you have all these different options. But if I continue to increase that number of options with choices, there will be a point in which you're going to be overwhelmed. And in that case, you're going to start now increasing the extrinsic stress. Now, um, things that you can think about that. For example, if I give you extra, and how will that manifest in particular? So, for example, if I say to you, all right, so I give you these three different choices to choose between fonts because you're, let's say, making a flyer or making a website, and I'm giving you choices, then that's an easy task. If I say, hey, choose among all of these choices, but I want you to be right. So that conditioning of, well, I'm going to give you so many choices that the chances of you making something that I will not appreciate are so much higher, then now you're going to start feeling stressed. So you're going to start thinking, what if I'm choosing the wrong ones? What if I'm taking a very long time? Should it take this long? So all of those questions that you're asking yourself, you are asking yourself. No one else is doing that for you. So it still is something that you're dealing with your own self, but this is a form of extrinsic stress. Now, this is one of the explanations as to why we tend to focus on less and less choices. So again, that idea that extrinsic stress in the form of choices can actually be so detrimental for you that at an unconscious level, you're trying to compensate by having less and less choices. One of the main problems that we encounter when talking about two opposing views then is that there are rarely two opposing views, but rather individual choices. So again, this is just a compensatory mechanism that you're using. You have so many choices that you are restricted to these two or three different choices that you have because it's easier for you to deal with that. But the reality is that there are way more choices than those. So one of the first problems that we encounter with the two opposing views is that we're kind of eliminating that enormous variety that I was discussing before of individual choices. The idea of opposing views is just an overly simplistic version of reality that doesn't cover the reality of the human experience. So most people's nuances will not be represented here. It's just a bunch of choices that have been lumped together. Now they're merged into two or three different choices, and then you choose one, you pick one, but you're eliminating the capacity to understand other points of view that are not either or. So another problem that we have, or we encounter with that, is that some choices tend to aggregate more people, giving the impression that those choices are stronger than others and that the ideas that they represent might be important. So again, just because you have more people, you're belonging to a group that has more people, that doesn't mean that you're closer to the true reality or that you're actually closer to being right. But that is a tricky part, right? Because we all tend to think, well, look at how many people are siding with me. Look at how many people I'm surrounded by. I must be doing something right because obviously I have these many people. But as I said before, a problem is that some of these choices tend to aggregate more people, and that gives us the impression that those choices are stronger, meaning more valid, and that the ideas that they represent might be important. So everything that I discuss has to do with perception, it doesn't have to do with reality. But again, what does this have to do with a false equivalence or false equivalence fallacy? Well, when you choose one side and you're surrounded by people with similar opinions as yours, your sense of reality might be skewed because of the amount of inputs that you're receiving in one direction. We have discussed this in the past at length. We're discussing these from the confirmation bias, and in-group bias, groupthink, even when we're talking about the social media, the Facebook, especially video that I make, or even the video about the Twitter, all of that, they have a lot in common. And the main thing that they have in common is that once you're surrounded by yourself by so many people who are thinking in one way, in thinking in one direction, it's actually very difficult. I would actually make the opposite argument. It's actually very difficult to not see how that is not true. It's very difficult to not be to be surrounded by so many people who side with you and think, "Oh, I might be wrong," because it's actually not. That is also not only that it's bad for you, because you would be recognizing that you're wrong about something, or you would be questioning that. Is that it seems like you were even questioning logic because there's so many people behind that it kind of sounds logical that I think that I'm right because I'm surrounded by so many people that are siding with me. But we have explained that in the past, especially when we were talking about the Wuzel effect and how that can be easily demonstrably wrong, meaning we can actually remove that by looking at the real information that is behind that and the reasons why people believe that certain people are right. And then at the end, what you're doing is basically giving the same information over and over and over again, but you're not checking the information in itself. But because there's so many people now saying the same thing, and you're one of them, then now you're just giving the impression again that your arguments are even stronger than they are. Now, we have been able to see this behavior over and over again in the last couple of years, especially when we're talking about uh, when we talk about people who are comparing their opinions to expert opinions, especially with the healthcare professionals. And this is when this might feel a little bit controversial to some, although it shouldn't. Part of the problem is that, as with the example of the fork in a bomb, there's some rationality behind this thought process. Healthcare professionals do make mistakes like everyone else. Even institutions in charge of researching a subject do also make mistakes. Researchers have their own biases. In fact, the whole idea behind the Wuzel effect that I've explained in the past is based on that, on how many people were making the assumption that just because so many people were talking about certain research in the past, that that idea must be right. And they were using that as a proof of being right. And then other people would use the same thought plus you as an example to prove their own theories. So again, all of that is actually true. The idea that researchers can often assume certain ideas based on misquotation of other people's research can have a trickle effect that will alter the validity of the results of the research. And that idea is not surprising. So again, if you are basing your ideas or your research on whatever it is someone else is saying, because you're saying, well, look at that person who's an expert, who's also backed by these other data, but you're not going ahead and checking all that data. You're just checking that person and basing that person's based on those ideas that you're now taking into account as a whole to make your point. So it is true that that exists in researching and it definitely exists in science. Now, but, and I cannot emphasize this enough, two options are not always equal. And in fact, I would say most of the time they're not equal. They're not. Just because you took the time and effort to think about one idea, or just because you surround yourself with people who side with you and have similar thoughts, doesn't mean that you're right. It just means that you thought of that idea and that you took the time to think about that idea and that you're surrounded by people who agree with you. That's just the only thing that that means. So again, this has nothing to do with the truth. It has nothing to do with reality. It just has to do with how you perceive reality. Now, and although finding out the truth is something that is very, very difficult, I'm not going to pretend that it's not. It's extremely complicated, definitely more complicated than we give credit to. There's also a problem when we talk about subjects and we don't define the parameters clearly. It is extremely important that we define that we are what we're trying to do before we're actually trying to do something, or before we're trying to for example, find some answers. And maybe that's what triggered all of these subjects in the first place. Maybe this is it. This is a portion that this is the reason why I decided to create this video in particular. The reason why I decided to create this video is because I was actually worried about this point, the point of saying, if we're actually just putting two things together, we have just putting two people in a room, two opposing views. What are you trying to get in the first place? Are you trying to compare two things that are opinions? Well, then define that. And from the beginning, clarify, you know what, like there's no point on us to be mad because I'm going to expose how I feel, how I think, but I know that there's no way I know if I'm right. There's no way that I can tell that. And by the way, there's no way that I can tell if you are going to be right. We're just going to be exposing that. Now, for example, in the last 2 years, again, we have been talking about, I'm going to give you a few examples. So maybe I can illustrate this a little bit better with this example. In the last 2 years, we have been talking about the effectiveness of using masks. Some people have argued that they're not effective, while the healthcare community have emphasized the importance of it. Although there's some people in the healthcare community, minority, who think they're actually not useful. But this is an example, actually, this is an example of how not to have these type of conversations. Now, why? Because it's not specific enough. It's like, what do you mean by working? Working for whom? Are you talking about working period, or are you talking about working for certain people? Working versus the possibility of you developing the sickness. So again, that is not a specific enough question. And I've been looking at it. There's so many debates with the same concept. There's so many debates that have been conducted with the same idea. But again, that is a futile debate because you're not establishing a good pattern. There's no clear ending to this. You're just going to shout what you feel, or what you believe, versus what another person feels and the other person believes. So again, it's just a matter of a shouting match between two different people having different opinions. But that's it. If the question is, do masks protect more people than people who are unmasked? That is a more specific question. And the answer can only be yes or no. Again, I'm going to repeat that question because if you think, well, it depends, you're not understanding the question. So if I'm asking that the question is, do masks protect more people than the people who are unmasked? Meaning, if you're masked, the people who are masked can be protected more than the people who are unmasked. The answer cannot be, it depends. It has to be either yes or no. You can define then how to interpret data, how to gather data. There can be a debate about that, but there cannot be a debate about where is, depends on who you're talking about. It's not a good metric. That is already a specific enough question. It requires a yes or no answer because the question was framed already in a way that is either yes or no. Now, you can argue again that you're not convinced about the research, you're not convinced by the people who are doing the research, but you cannot argue that it depends on the person because that is not the thing that is being asked. If you're asking, does mask usage benefit everyone equally? Again, the answer is a yes or no because it cannot be a depends. Why? Because there are nuances. And if there are nuances and you say, well, there's some people that would definitely not be benefited by that because they might have like a weird reaction to masks, or they might have some complications or medical complications that make them actually more anxious, or they might actually have a respiratory problem that actually be concerning. So again, in that case, you are saying, well, the risk of this person who might live in an isolated area. He's not in contact with anybody else, but he also has this problem, a respiratory problem that makes that masking is actually harder for that person. Then if the question is, do mask usage benefit everyone equally? Then the answer is no, not everyone is going to be benefited the same way. Some people are going to be more benefited than others. Now, do the majority of people are going to be benefited? That is also an interesting question to ask. I believe that the majority of people were benefited by masking. Now, you can also, again, ask who would not be benefit by mask usage because the downside for them, again, because medical exceptions make them more likely to suffer consequences because of mask usage than the risk of catching the virus. This is an example of a more nuanced question because it forces the person to look at variability. And that is an important point that I wanted to repeat again. Now, first examples that I gave you are true or false statements. Those are necessary to achieve closure in a conversation. So not all things are equal. And when confronted with a question where there's a yes or no answer, two opposing views just means that someone is right and someone is wrong. I'm going to repeat that because I don't want to continue if this is not understood. So when there is a type of question that leads to a yes or no answer, and there are two opposing views, there cannot be depends. It has to be that yes or no, and two opposing views. That means that necessarily one person is going to be right and the other person is going to be wrong. That doesn't mean that the person who's wrong is going to accept. Of course, it's not. No one is going to accept that. It's very difficult. But it is important to establish that. And it's also important to establish that someone is right and someone is wrong. Now, the last example that I gave you is a more nuanced, and this cannot be answered with just a yes or no. This type of question requires a lengthy and more nuanced approach, highlighting the differences between different types of people. So again, we're talking about like difference of opinions. We're talking about things that will really depend. Then that question is not specific enough, then you have to actually acknowledge that and you have to take the time to acknowledge and answer those questions properly. You cannot just say simply yes or no just because and expect other people to believe that what you're saying is true. It is important for us to understand which type of question we're asking or which type of problem we're trying to solve. A yes or no, true or false type of question or problem, or a more nuanced type of problem. I don't know type of questions or problem. Don't get me wrong, this can be challenging in itself. Establishing what type of question is the question you're trying to say might not be apparent to other people. So if I say to you, do masks work or not? That might be triggering for some people because people were saying, well, yes. Some people were saying no. And who's right? Well, in this case, since this is that it depends, you would actually have to describe that a little bit better. You would actually have to be a little bit more specific in the way in which you're phrasing the question. Otherwise, the yes or no is actually not, both answers are incorrect because it really depends. Now, if I ask you the question, do you believe, not do you believe, if I ask you the question, do masks protect more people than they do cause harm, then the answer has to be either yes or no. And in this case, it's yes. It has been shown to be a yes. It's not really up to the debate. Now, you might say, well, what happened with me? I'm a person who is at risk because of these other medical problems, and I actually live in an area in which I don't cross paths with anybody. Well, in your case, you actually might be an exception, but that is included in the question, the majority of people. And the majority of people is not people like you. The majority of people is people like other people. So, again, it is important to define those because the difference in terms of answers can actually um, will depend on the way that you phrase the question. Now, I wanted to say this, and I know that this is triggering for a lot of people because I'm talking a lot about like being right and being wrong, but it is important from a psychological point of view to establish some order. As I have explained in the past, our ancestors had to deal with a lot of uncertainty from finding food or not being killed. And that's one of the reasons why we always look for security. Not knowing our surroundings often meant death, we have discussed these, or diminishing quality of life, and the opposing or the opposite of order, meaning chaos, has a direct impact on not only our overall happiness, but also it contributes into our stress. So understanding that there are unknowns and checking if I have the necessary skills to understand the problem is crucial. So when confronted with a question, first thing that you have to understand is, do you have the necessary knowledge to understand this? And to avoid frustration, to avoid of those many times in which you are going to encounter situations in which you don't know what you're talking about, you don't have to debate everything. You don't even have to form an opinion about everything. You can just wait until you actually have more understanding of the problem before you start having an opinion. And that is good for you and for the rest, for you, mainly because of what I just said, because not having, not knowing, not knowing your surroundings already is tough enough, but constantly fighting with other people will increase that reminder of you might be wrong. There might be something else that you're not seeing. And it is important for you to establish that from the very beginning so you don't stress yourself. But it's also good for the other people because it turns out that if you don't have enough knowledge, they're actually not debating someone who have knowledge. They're just debating someone who thinks that they have a strong opinion about something. Now, understanding again that there are knowns and checking if I have the necessary skills to understand the problem is crucial. And even when something is evident and true, because I also have to go to the other extreme. Let's say that you do have expertise on something. Let's say that you have enough knowledge about something. Even if you have that knowledge and there's evidence of true, still keep in mind that there's a possibility for you to be wrong, misunderstanding the problem, misunderstanding your true capacities, etc. But again, I understand that all of these can contribute to that idea of you not understanding what's going on. But the best way, again, the best approach in this case is to actually not having even to engage in these type of conversations, because although you might think, well, I'm going to stick to my guns and I'm going to continue thinking what I'm thinking, when you engage in this type of conversation, you're just finding and being reminded constantly that there's opposing views, that there's a possibility that you don't understand what you're talking about. Understanding that most things are a matter of degrees of importance, but at the same time, focusing on what we know to be true is key to having a meaningful conversation. So now I'm going to flip the script. I'm going to actually do the opposite. Now I'm going to say, well, there are plenty of things that you have discussed or you discussed that you have no expertise whatsoever. And for those, you should actually not only remain humble, but not even engage in conversations in which there are different opinions because you're still forming yours, or at least you have an opinion, but you don't know if you're right. That is one thing. But also, finding opinions or finding conversations in which you do know what you're talking about is beneficial. And it's also meaningful to have these conversations with other people, especially with people who have opposing views, to kind of see how other people sees those their opinions. Why did they reach such conclusions? Also, and as a consequence of what I just laid down, we have to be careful with having too many open conversations, meaning open to debates, open in the sense of not clear, open in the sense of we will not know the truth, in which we cannot find the answers, etc. Now, having too many of these conversations often, this type of it depends type of conversations often leads people to feeling more frustrated and with the idea that the other person doesn't understand your position or is unwilling to accept the truth. Again, that is because you're going to that conversation with that idea that you are having the truth or you're convinced that what you know is true, not understanding that what you know is just a belief. You just have a belief, not something that you understand, just a belief. A lot of the times, this happens when the purpose of the conversation has not been properly defined, or when the answers are not simple, yes or no. Where we just have beliefs or just believe them to be yes or no. So, in summary, every conversation is different. Hopefully, this is going to be a summary of everything that I just laid out. Every conversation is different, and some debates are open debates in which we cannot know the answers. There's no way, there's no quantifiable way in which I can actually say that. Like, for example, which country is better? You cannot establish that efficient. That is not a metric. You can measure things. Like, for example, if you say, well, for me, life expectancy and quality of life is an important thing. Well, expectancy is an example of a measurable thing. People can actually measure the life expectancy at birth of the majority of people by counting how many people have died during that year and what are the ages. And then you can establish that parameter. And you can compare that number that you obtain with other countries with the same metric. However, quality of life is actually not something that you can measure. Yes, there are some metrics that have been used, but again, those are made up metrics that might reflect, like, for example, the quality of life measures life expectancy. It also literacy and then access to home, basically, among other things, right? So it depends on what you value. Maybe you value other things as important. That is has an effect on your quality of life, meaning having access to people who are supportive for you is actually better for you because that's what gives you true happiness. So in that case, you will be actually happier in one place than other, despite that the other place has a higher quality of life by using the metrics that people are using. So again, we have to define the things that can be defined and the things that cannot be defined. And the things that can be defined are those things that you can measure. So now, every conversation is different, and some debates are open debates in which we cannot know the answers. And also, not all opinions are equal. Just because two things have been put together doesn't mean that they're equally valid. It is important to go into debates acknowledging this idea of not knowing the answers, and that after the debate, we will still not know the answers. That will avoid a lot of frustration. Again, you go to a debate and you say, are masks good or bad? Well, this is a type of conversation in which we cannot know the answers. There's no possibility of knowing the answers because there's no metric that we can use that satisfy the questions, are good or bad. Now, are they good for the majority of people to defend against a pandemic? The answer is yes. There's nothing that you can say that changes that because that is an objectable measure. Now, you can actually debate the way in which you can measure. You can debate in which if that is a proper metric, but the question was already defined. Now, second, the idea that not all ideas are equal is going to be even more exposed in the other type of conversations. The type of conversations in which you do know the answers, the ones in which you have objective answers that are either true or false or yes or no type of answers. In this case, someone must be right and someone must be wrong. And I'm going to repeat that again. In these type of conversations in which you have objective, measurable data, then there's no really a debate. It's just a matter of true or false. The problem is when people are confused about, well, I don't believe that is to be true. Well, that is a belief, but that doesn't mean that it's not true. They just believe that you believe that is not true. But again, that is true according to the question. So again, it is extremely important to determine the parameters of these types of debates and establish from the beginning the type of debates. But it's also important once you establish in this particular type of debate in which you are encountering a yes or no type of answer, that you establish a winner, like when you go to a boxing or an MMA competition. It is important for us to establish with the conversation that we've had, we have laid out the questions in a way that is only a yes or no type of answer. At the end of the case, the answer needs to be evident and it needs to be clear. It's either yes or no, and there needs to be someone who's right and someone who's no, and someone needs to be said, all right, you're right, and someone needs to be said, you're wrong. Now, this sounds controversial because no one likes to be wrong and no one likes you to be called, no one likes to be called out. But it is extremely important to establish a winner in this pursuit for the truth. Again, this is only in cases in which there are objective or there's objective data that can be measured and there's not really up for a debate. I know that I have emphasized the idea in the past, and I continue to do so, of not using this knowledge or this understanding of biases to punish people, and it is important to continue to do that. Again, it's not a matter of you just punishing people and saying, you see, you should watch this. But it is important to establish this difference between, again, things that are objectively true and things that are not. Things that require an answer that is objective based on measured data and things that are not. Next, I will be talking about attentional bias, or how when confronted with an important decision, we tend to focus on some possibilities and ignore others and how that can affect the outcome. I know that, again, this has been a controversial video because I continue to talk about true and false. But again, the bias is not only about just being loosey goosey in terms of um, everything is equal and everything is valid. Now, sometimes I believe that maybe I haven't made this clear, but it's important for me to establish that the knowledge about bias is for you to self reflection, for you to know exactly what's going on. I continue to say that, but that doesn't mean that when talking about these type of subjects, like for example, when talking about having people with two opposite views, that doesn't mean that they're both going to be equally valid, and therefore it should just should act as if they're equally valid. There's not such thing. Like there's in this case, we have to define first of all, is this something that has an objective, measured answer? If the answer is yes or no, you're encountering a yes or no type of situation, and therefore someone must be right and someone must be wrong. But if you're asking a question, if you're confronting a problem that is more open, is actually not measurable, is something that it depends on how you see it, then you're not encountering true or false or yes or no type of question. For that case, or in that case, then you have to acknowledge that you might not know enough. Or even if you know a lot, you have to acknowledge that maybe there's some things that you have to consider, or you at least will not reach a truthful conclusion because there's nothing to be reached because it's all about opinions. So, as usual, I hope that this is useful. I know that this is a long video. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.